The realization hit Nick Parker like a sledgehammer on a crisp autumn morning in Boston. He sat at his kitchen counter, hands trembling around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, staring at the newspaper article that threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew about reality. The headline was simple enough: Milwaukee surgeon performs miraculous emergency surgery. But it was the grainy photo beneath that made his blood run cold, because he remembered being there, remembered holding that scalpel, remembered saving that patient's life. Except Nick Parker wasn't a surgeon. He had never set foot in Milwaukee. He pushed the newspaper away and ran his fingers through his disheveled dark hair, trying to make sense of what was happening. The calendar on his wall showed October 12th, and that date seemed to mock him. 3 months. It had been 3 months since the first incident, when he went to sleep in his Boston apartment and woke up, truly woke up, as someone else, somewhere else. At first, he had dismissed it as unusually vivid dreams. As a private investigator, he was used to strange cases and even stranger hours, so when he started having incredibly detailed dreams about living other lives, he chalked it up to stress and an overactive imagination. But then the evidence started piling up, impossible to ignore. The surgeon in Milwaukee wasn't the first. There was the detective in Seattle who had cracked a cold case. Nick remembered every detail of that investigation, could still feel the weight of the badge that wasn't his. Then there was the fugitive in Miami, a man wanted for a string of art heists. Nick remembered the adrenaline of the escape, the feel of stolen canvas under his fingers, the salt air on his face as he fled along the coast. These weren't dreams. They were lives. Real lives, leaving real consequences in the world. Nick pulled out his leather-bound notebook, its pages now filled with frantically scribbled notes, newspaper clippings, and photographs. He had started documenting everything 3 weeks ago, when the pattern became impossible to ignore. Each dream left traces: newspaper articles, police reports, social media posts. Every morning, he would wake up back in his Boston apartment and spend hours searching for evidence of what he had done, who he had been. The door buzzer interrupted his thoughts, making him jump. Nick wasn't expecting any clients. He had stopped taking cases 2 weeks ago, after nearly missing a crucial surveillance operation because he had woken up as a high school teacher in Oregon that day. He approached the intercom cautiously. "Who is it?" "Dr. Sarah Chen," a woman's voice replied, clear and professional. "I need to talk to you about your condition, Mr. Parker." Nick's hand froze over the intercom button. He had never told anyone about what was happening to him. How could this person possibly know? "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I think you do," Dr. Chen responded. "The surgeon in Milwaukee. The detective in Seattle. The art thief in Miami. And those are just the ones you know about." Nick's throat went dry. He looked at his notebook, then back at the intercom. "How do you know about that?" "Because," Dr. Chen said, "I've been tracking similar cases for the past 5 years. And if my research is correct, you have until March 10th to figure out what's happening to you. After that." She paused. "After that, one of those lives becomes permanent. The question is, which one?" Nick's investigative instincts warred with his paranoia. Everything about this situation screamed trap, but Dr. Chen knew too much for him to simply turn her away. Besides, he was running out of options, and time. He buzzed her up. Dr. Sarah Chen was not what he expected. She was younger than her voice suggested, probably in her early 30s, wearing a charcoal gray pantsuit that looked like it cost more than Nick's monthly rent. Her black hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she carried a sleek leather briefcase that seemed to be handcuffed to her wrist. "The security precautions are necessary," she said, noticing his glance at the handcuff. "There are people who would kill for what's in here." Nick gestured to his living room, which had become a maze of cork boards covered in photos, newspaper clippings, and red string connecting various incidents. Dr. Chen's eyes scanned the walls with professional interest. "You've been thorough," she commented, setting her briefcase on his coffee table. But you're missing connections. Look here. She pointed to a photo of the Seattle detective. Detective James Morrison. Solved the Henderson cold case on January 15. But what you don't know is that on that same night, a professor in Vancouver made a breakthrough in quantum mechanics, and a priest in San Diego performed what his congregation is calling a miracle. Nick's head spun. Are you saying there were others? Other lives, happening simultaneously? Now you're asking the right questions. Dr. Chen clicked open her briefcase, revealing a laptop with a symbol Nick didn't recognize, a Mobius strip wrapped around an hourglass. We call it the convergence pattern. It's been happening for decades, maybe centuries, but it's accelerating. People living multiple lives in their sleep, their consciousness splitting across parallel existences. Most never realize what's happening. They write it off as dreams, déjà vu, or stress. But a few, like you, become aware. She opened her laptop and pulled up a series of graphs and charts that made Nick's eyes hurt. The pattern always follows the same rules. 3 months of fragmentation, followed by convergence. On the final day, in your case, March 10th, all the parallel lives collapse into one. The subject's consciousness chooses one reality and stays there. Permanently. Chooses. Nick interrupted. How does it choose? Dr. Chen's expression darkened. That's the part we haven't figured out yet. In some cases, it seems random. In others. She pulled up a new file. In others, it appears to be influenced by external factors. Or internal ones. Strong emotions, unfinished business, a sense of purpose or belonging. Nick thought about the lives he'd lived. The surgeon saving lives. The detective solving crimes. The art thief running free. Each one felt real, felt right in its own way. How could he possibly choose? But that's not why I'm here, Dr. Chen continued, her voice taking on an urgency that made Nick's investigator instincts prickle. I'm here because you're different. Most subjects experience 3 or 4 parallel lives. You're experiencing dozens, maybe hundreds. And they're not just parallel, they're interconnected. She pulled out a familiar newspaper clipping, the Milwaukee surgeon story. The patient you saved? He was a key witness in Detective Morrison's cold case. The painting stolen in Miami? It contained hidden coordinates that led to a scientific discovery in Vancouver. Your lives aren't just running parallel, Mr. Parker. They're working together, building towards something. The question is, what? Before Nick could process this revelation, his phone buzzed. It was a news alert, another life he didn't remember living had left its mark on the world. But this time, something was different. This time, it was closer to home. Local private investigator Nicholas Parker linked to international conspiracy, the headline read. Boston police seek information on missing person case. Nick looked up at Dr. Chen, his mouth dry. I haven't taken any cases in 2 weeks. I haven't investigated anything except my own condition. Exactly, Dr. Chen said grimly. So who's using your name? And more importantly, which version of you is it? Nick grabbed his coat. We need to go to the police station. If someone's using my identity. That would be a mistake, Dr. Chen cut him off. Think about it. How would you explain this? You can't prove you weren't involved because you can't account for where all versions of you have been. The moment you walk into that station, you'll be detained for questioning. And what happens if you fall asleep in custody? She had a point. Nick had already experienced one particularly harrowing incident where he dozed off during a stakeout and woken up as a deep-sea researcher in the Gulf of Mexico. If he fell asleep in police custody and woke up somewhere else. Then what do you suggest? Dr. Chen was already packing up her laptop. We need to find out which version of you is operating in Boston. If there's another Nick Parker walking around this city, we need to track him down before he does something that permanently compromises your life here. Nick's investigator instincts kicked in. The article mentioned a missing person case. That's somewhere to start. Agreed. But we need to be careful. If my theories about the convergence pattern are correct, this isn't a coincidence. All of your parallel lives are accelerating toward March 10th, and they're starting to intersect in increasingly dramatic ways. They took Dr. Chen's car, a nondescript gray sedan that Nick suspected was far more sophisticated than it appeared. As they drove through Boston's evening traffic, he noticed that she took an erratic route, doubling back several times as if checking for tails. "You never told me who you work for," Nick said, watching her hands on the steering wheel. They were steady, professional, the hands of someone used to high-pressure situations. "An organization that studies quantum anomalies in human consciousness," she replied, smoothly changing lanes. "We've had many names over the years. Currently, we're called the Threshold Institute. And how many others like me have you studied?" Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on the road. "In the past century? 17 confirmed cases. But none quite like yours. The average subject experiences 3 to 4 parallel lives. The highest we'd recorded before you was 7. You're experiencing dozens, possibly hundreds. It's unprecedented." "Lucky me," Nick muttered, then froze as they passed a newspaper stand. The evening edition was just being put out, and the headline made his blood run cold: "Second body found in Boston Harbor investigation." Dr. Chen saw it too and accelerated slightly. "It's escalating faster than I expected. We need to get to the harbor." The drive to the harbor was tense with unspoken questions. Nick's mind raced through possibilities. Was one of his other selves the killer? Or was one of them working to solve these murders? Could both be true simultaneously? They parked near the waterfront, where red and blue lights painted the gathering dusk. Police boats dotted the harbor, and a small crowd of reporters had already gathered behind the yellow crime scene tape. Nick instinctively hung back, aware that his face might be known to the police now. Dr. Chen pulled something from her briefcase, a small device that looked like a smartphone but was covered in unfamiliar symbols. "This detects quantum irregularities," she explained. "If another version of you has been here recently, it should pick up traces of the consciousness overlap." The device emitted a soft blue glow and began to pulse. Dr. Chen frowned at the readings. "This is strange. The pattern is fragmented. It's as if multiple versions of you were here at the same time, their consciousness signatures overlapping." "Is that possible?" "In theory, no. Each parallel life should remain distinct until the final convergence. Unless..." She trailed off, her eyes widening as the device's pulsing increased dramatically. "We need to move. Now." "What? Why?" "Because according to these readings, you're already here. Multiple versions of you. And they're all converging on this spot." As if on cue, a figure stepped out of the shadows ahead of them. Nick felt his reality tilt sideways, because he was staring at his own face, but not quite. This version of him was harder, colder, with a scar above his right eye that Nick didn't have. Dr. Chen, his double said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Right on schedule." Nick instinctively stepped in front of Dr. Chen, but she moved forward, her demeanor shifting from academic to tactical in an instant. "Which one are you?" she demanded. "Does it matter?" the other Nick replied. "We're all heading to the same place. March 10th. The convergence point. But some of us have figured out how to accelerate the process." A police siren wailed in the distance, and Nick noticed more shadows moving at the edges of his vision. More figures. More versions of himself. "The murders," Nick said, the pieces clicking into place. "You're forcing the convergence. Eliminating possibilities." "Smart," his scarred double said. That's the detective in us. But you're thinking too small. We're not just eliminating possibilities, we're creating necessity. Every death, every solved case, every stolen artwork, every scientific breakthrough, they're all connected. We're building something bigger than any single life could achieve. Dr. Chen's quantum detector was pulsing frantically now, its blue light casting eerie shadows on the wet pavement. The pattern's destabilizing, she warned. This level of convergence shouldn't be possible yet. You're going to tear reality apart. The other Nick laughed. Reality? Which reality, Dr. Chen? The one where I'm a surgeon saving lives? A detective solving crimes? A thief living free? Or maybe? His eyes locked onto Nick's. Maybe the reality where I'm a private investigator who stumbled onto something bigger than he could imagine. More figures were emerging from the shadows now. Nick could see them clearly, versions of himself from different lives. The surgeon, still wearing scrubs stained with blood. The detective, badge glinting in the dim light. The art thief, elegant in black. And others he didn't recognize, dozens of them, each with slight variations, each with their own story. What do you want? Nick demanded, fighting the surreal vertigo of seeing himself multiplied like a fractured mirror. Want? The scarred Nick spread his arms. We want what you want. To solve the mystery. To understand why this is happening to us. But most of all, we want to control it. Think about it, why choose one life when we could have them all? The human consciousness isn't meant to fragment like this, Dr. Chen interjected. The convergence happens for a reason. If you try to maintain multiple parallel lives past the convergence point, we'll transcend, another Nick finished, this one wearing a professor's tweeds. We'll become something new. Something unprecedented. You'll die, Dr. Chen said flatly. All of you. The strain on your consciousness will be catastrophic. The scarred Nick's smile widened. Maybe. Or maybe we'll evolve. But here's the real question, are you willing to risk everything to stop us? Because we're all you, Nick. Every single one of us. Stop us, and you're stopping yourself. Help us, and you could become something beyond human imagination. Nick felt the weight of dozens of his own eyes on him. Each version of himself represented a life he'd lived, a path he'd taken. And each one was now offering him a choice, fight against his own possibilities, or embrace them all, consequences be damned. Dr. Chen's hand touched his arm. Nick, she said quietly. Whatever you're thinking, remember, this isn't just about you anymore. The barriers between realities are already weakening. If the convergence fails, reality itself fractures, the scarred Nick finished. Exciting, isn't it? Now, brother, what's it going to be? Are you with us, or against us? Nick looked at his multiplication of selves, each one a road not taken, each one a life he could have led. Then he looked at Dr. Chen, who had sought him out to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophe. The quantum detector in her hand was pulsing faster now, its light almost strobing, as if reality itself was approaching a breaking point. And somewhere in the distance, a clock began to strike midnight, marking one day closer to March 10th. Nick Parker had spent his life, all of his lives, solving puzzles. As a detective, he knew that the hardest cases often hinged on the smallest details. As a surgeon, he'd learned that the slightest deviation could mean the difference between life and death. As a thief, he understood that timing was everything. Now, facing a multitude of himself, he noticed something that none of his other versions seemed to realize. You're right, he said to his scarred double. This is about evolution. About transcendence. But you're not seeing the whole picture. He turned to Dr. Chen. Your quantum detector, it's not just measuring the convergence, is it? It's influencing it. Dr. Chen's expression didn't change, but her grip on the device tightened slightly. The scarred Nick's eyes narrowed. The Threshold Institute isn't studying the convergence, Nick continued, the pieces falling into place. They're orchestrating it. Creating multiple versions of consciousness, then forcing them to collapse back into one. But something went wrong with me, didn't it? I fragmented more than you expected. Created more possibilities than you could control. Clever, Dr. Chen said softly. But incomplete. We didn't create the convergence phenomenon, we discovered it. It's a natural cycle, happening constantly around us. Most people live countless parallel lives without ever knowing it. But some, like you, become aware. And a very few. She looked around at the gathering of Nicks. A very few learn to control it. That's why you're really here, the scarred Nick said. Not to stop us, but to study us. To see what happens when multiple conscious versions decide to work together instead of collapsing into one. The murders in the harbor, Nick said. The solved cases, the stolen art, the scientific breakthroughs, they weren't just random intersections. They were tests. Experiments to see how far we could push the boundaries of consciousness. And you've exceeded all expectations, Dr. Chen admitted. But now you're at a crossroads. The convergence is coming, whether you want it or not. You can fight it, try to maintain these multiple lives, and risk destroying not just yourself but the very fabric of reality. Or what? Or you can help us understand it. Guide it. There are others like you out there, Nick. People living multiple lives, afraid and alone. With your help, we could learn to control the convergence, to help people navigate their parallel lives safely. The quantum detector's pulsing had settled into a steady rhythm now, like a heartbeat. Around them, the other versions of Nick waited, watching, each one representing a different path, a different possibility. And if I refuse? Nick asked. Then you'll have until March 10th to choose which life you want to keep, Dr. Chen said. The others will fade away, becoming nothing more than dreams, memories of paths not taken. And all of this, everything you've learned, everything you could become, will be lost. Nick looked at his other selves, each one a story unfinished, a mystery unsolved. The surgeon who saved lives. The detective who solved impossible cases. The thief who lived without boundaries. The professor who sought ultimate truth. And countless others, each with their own dreams, their own purposes. You're assuming, he said slowly, that we have to choose between saving one life or risking them all. But what if there's another way? What if the convergence isn't about choosing one reality over the others, but about finding the truth that connects them all? The scarred Nick stepped forward. What are you suggesting? We're all investigators in our own way, Nick said. Seeking truth, solving puzzles, pushing boundaries. Maybe that's not a coincidence. Maybe that's the key to understanding why this happened to us specifically. He turned to Dr. Chen. You said the convergence is a natural cycle. What if it's not about elimination or transcendence? What if it's about integration? Finding the common thread that runs through all our lives. The quantum detector's pulse changed, its light shifting from blue to a deep purple. Dr. Chen stared at it in fascination. The pattern, it's stabilizing. But not collapsing. How? Because we're not fighting the convergence anymore, Nick said. We're working with it. Each of us holds a piece of the puzzle. Together, we might understand not just why this happened to us, but why it happens at all. The harbor lights flickered, and for a moment, reality seemed to shimmer around them. When Nick looked again, he saw his other selves differently, not as separate entities, but as facets of a larger truth, each one essential, each one part of a greater whole. March 10th was still coming. The convergence was inevitable. But now, standing at the edge of Boston Harbor with his multiplicities around him and a universe of possibilities ahead, Nick Parker realized that the real mystery wasn't which life he would choose. It was understanding why he had been chosen for all of them. The clock struck its final toll, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, another version of Nick Parker went to sleep, preparing to wake into yet another life, adding another piece to a puzzle that stretched across realities, a puzzle that would either destroy him or reveal a truth beyond anything any single version of himself could imagine. The choice, as always, would be his. All of his.